Good. Well, today we'd like to give a very warm welcome to a member of our advisory board, in fact, Roger Trigg, who's Professor of Philosophy at Warwick University. Professor Trigg has been involved in many different philosophical societies in this country and indeed internationally. He was the founding chairman of the British Philosophical Association and also the founding president of the British Society for the Philosophy of Religion, and has been involved not only in those societies since in other ways, but also in a number of other societies to do with philosophy, and particularly philosophy and religion. He's also written a huge number of books. I hope that people here will be aware of those. If not, if you go on his biography on the website, then you'll be able to click there and see a list of those books, and I would recommend those books to you. And also, as I mentioned, we're very grateful to him for serving on our advisory board. And today he's going to speak to us on science religion in the public domain. So thank you very much.
Right, well, thank you very much, Dennis. Today, I want to talk about whether, in fact, science and religion are looked at equally in the public domain. This brings in the whole issue of religion in public life, which is actually the title of a book that I've just written. I'm correcting proofs at the moment. It's going to be out next February, Oxford University Press, if I give the commercial. But interestingly enough, it does, this whole subject, gel with things that we read in the papers every day. Just over the last few days, of course, there's been a lot of discussion about how far people should be identified through what they wear as belonging to a particular religion. I mean, the particular argument recently has been Muslim women wearing the veil so that you can't even see anything beyond their eyes. There was also a woman last week who was sacked by British Airways for wearing a cross. No, the idea is that you mustn't in any way display anything religious in public life dealing with the public. And this is creeping in all kinds of ways. Coming up to the Christmas season all too soon, you'll find that it isn't a coincidence that some people will send cards saying season's greetings, or if you're American, happy holidays. They veer off talking about Christmas, which to some extent I think is a bit hypocritical, because they want to celebrate Christmas, but they don't want to admit what it is they're celebrating. It's in the spirit of when I was in Toronto a few years back. A Christmas tree was being erected outside my hotel in the city, in front of the City Hall in Toronto. I mean, it looked like a Christmas tree. It was a Christmas tree. It was just before the Christmas season. Advent Sunday was coming up. More importantly, perhaps the Christmas shopping season was coming up. But suddenly City Hall issued an edict, because of course Toronto is a multicultural city nowadays. And what they said was that this is not a Christmas tree, it's a holiday tree. Whereupon all hell broke loose, and people objected strongly, and in the end the mayor said, no, it is actually a Christmas tree. And he said something actually rather wise: just because we respect other people's traditions doesn't mean we can't celebrate our own. And, but it does show, these are in a sense symbols, but gradually the pressure is on for them to be more than symbols, that actually religion isn't something that's mentioned in polite company. You don't certainly perhaps even mention it in school, certainly not in the United States. Why is this? Well, there are two very powerful currents in contemporary thought. One is encapsulated in a sometimes exaggerated respect for science and scientists as the sole source of established knowledge, and the other involves an appreciation of radical difference between people in their beliefs about the nature of the world and the place of humanity in it. So there's a celebration of diversity. Yet, at the same time, celebrating this diversity, and all that means is, by celebrating is, or let everybody believe what they want and it's up to them, it gets to be a kind of relativism. Science still appears as a settled body of knowledge with a recognized procedure for resolving differences. So there's a divergence then between science and religion. There's been a strong tendency, indeed, since the 18th century to see the realm of science as exclusively the realm of reasons, and reason then becomes narrowed in its application to be just reason as recognized by a scientific method. It was actually a tendency that I see that the present Pope attacked in his notorious lecture, which was basically, I thought, a very good lecture, in Germany, when he just in one sentence appeared to attack Islam. But the rest of it was actually attack on Western secularism and the narrowing of the notion of reason so that it couldn't apply to faith. Indeed, at the same time, there's been a narrowing of the English word science to mean only empirical investigation. It's much narrower even than the German word Wissenschaft. Yet, in all this, there is an underlying tension between the idea of science as the repository of truth, the sole repository very often, and the dismissal of worldviews and theology together with all non-scientific beliefs. Now that's classic materialism. Science is the path to truth. But the problem comes when one looks at the reasons for such dismissal. Ultimately, it all comes down to the fact of radical disagreement, in the sense that not only do people have different views, it may be said, but in religion, at any rate, there seems to be no conceivable way of settling the differences, no agreed procedure, and it might be thought perhaps science is different in that. Even if scientists can't agree, all scientists worthy of the name, it is assumed, would agree if, in fact, they follow correct scientific procedure and had full evidence available. They know how to go about resolving disputes. But even so, I think this emphasis on agreement is perhaps a little bit too quick, because disagreement itself is the lifeblood of science. Science would soon fossilize if everyone accepted the present state of the subjects and didn't ask awkward questions about the basis of theories. And scientific knowledge, and I think very often the general public doesn't really realize this, scientific knowledge is at best partial. Indeed it must be open to challenge and revision. The very moment when everything seems most agreed is perhaps the dawn of an era when even the whole basis of it all is challenged. Just look back to the end of the 19th century when people thought physics can't go anywhere else, and then suddenly we got quantum mechanics. But still we've got this purported agreed framework of observation and experiment, although at the frontiers of science I think it's true that even there things begin to break down when people talk about many universes, for instance. What do we do when we're confronted with scientists reaching out to a reality that eludes their grasp? Then the limitations of human reason become obvious. Do we dismiss their theories as a matter of faith, not reason? Don't we, on the other hand, often see that disagreement about truth doesn't necessarily mean that there is no truth? Science breeds radical disagreements, which sometimes actually threaten to say transcend the settled procedures of established science, also elicit opposition to its purported monopoly of truth. In recent years, the modern world very significantly has engendered a reaction. I don't want to talk about so-called postmodernism today, but it's interesting that this 18th century view of reason has been challenged, and the whole notion of universality, of rationality, is under threat. But many may instinctively draw back from that kind of nihilism, and they turn gratefully again to science as a body of belief that can be trusted. They may be happy to accept the postmodernist analysis of non-scientific beliefs, but they want to retain the modernist trust in science. I find, I don't know if any of you are familiar, for instance, with the writings of Richard Rorty, the philosopher, but he tends to take that line. He tends to trust science whilst being very much a pluralist relativist about other things. There's an inherent tension in that approach, but it's often encapsulated in the idea that science is objective. It deals with facts, shades of the Vienna Circle and verificationism, in contrast with religion, which deals with values. I always shudder when people talk about values nowadays. It's on everyone's lips. But what are values? Very often it sounds as if values are what people happen to value. They're not things inherent in the nature of things. So there's almost a subjectivity built in there. They're valid for the person or group holding them, not necessarily anyone else. But facts are out there in the public world. Science deals with facts. They're accessible to everyone. Now, verificationism, the kind that Ayer popularized in Language, Truth and Logic, has fallen on hard times. But the attitude that lie behind verificationism, the respect, the exaggerated respect for science, and the denigration of the non-scientific, still lives on. It lives most notably in Richard Dawkins' latest book on the God delusion, for instance. I mean, there he takes evidence as being what is accessible to science. That's the only kind of evidence. Reason is reason that scientists cope with, nothing else. And it's really verificationism writ large, and I suppose not surprising, because Dawkins grew up in the kind of period where it was still very influential. But labelling beliefs as values and referring to value judgments rather suggests that somehow they're not meaningless, they're subjective. Somehow they're found wanting in comparison with facts. Now, I mentioned Rorty, the American pragmatist philosopher, who thinks that science is acceptable in the public sphere, but in true pragmatist fashion, he rather believes the purpose of inquiry is to achieve agreement among human beings about what to do, and he thinks science can and other things can't. Indeed, he, in fact, is very suspicious of the role of religion. He upholds the wall of separation that Americans talk about between church and state. And in Rorty's words, the main reason religion needs to be privatized, and here we have a very significant word, religion is a matter for the private sphere, not the public, is that in political discussion with those outside the relevant religious community, it is a conversation stopper. I mean, I suppose that's a psychological or sociological fact. I don't think necessarily all religion is outside the sphere of reason. I think he actually is assuming it is. He holds to the view of contemporary liberal philosophers that we won't be able to keep a democratic political community going unless religious believers remain willing to trade privatization for a guarantee of religious liberty. How gracious of the liberal to actually say that, of course. I mean, it shows that liberals aren't very liberal when they come up against things they don't agree with. We will let you be free as long as, and then there are conditions. People can be free to espouse religion as long as they keep quiet about it, as long as they don't cause a public nuisance. The Enlightenment's legacy of distrust of religion, of insulating it from the realm of reason, as I've talked about it, is held as a good example. And Rorty calls the secularization of public life the Enlightenment's central achievement. Now, this isn't just a philosophical view, this is echoing through all our societies. In some societies it's clearer than others. If you look at France, I mean, it is actually public doctrine about the life of the Republic. It isn't so much here, but it's creeping in government policy more and more. And I would have thought that actually there's no ground for privileging science or downgrading religion unless you have a very particular doctrine about what counts as rational. Science is, religion isn't. Now, Rorty regards the stopping of conversation as the arbiter, and the desirability of democratic agreement becomes the criterion, so you've got to all get along in society. Well, and then we're back with the idea that science has this agreed framework and religion, and of course the difficulty is what is religion, and all religion tends, particularly by people who attack it, to get lumped together. I mean, it is actually a corollary, I think, of the idea that religion isn't rational, that you can't distinguish one religion from the other, so that Christianity is lumped in with people who indulge in child sacrifice, etc. I mean, it's all part of the same irrational activity. But what is it about science that makes it acceptable in the public sphere? And what is it about religion that doesn't? If you're a relativist, both should be equally acceptable to their adherents, so something more than that is needed. Perhaps a metaphysical belief that the only things which exist are those which are accessible to science. But of course that begs the question against religion in a particular way, a very spectacular way in fact, because religion is denigrated, because it's based on a particular metaphysics about what's real. And the whole question then goes round in a circle. We won't have religion because we have a particular metaphysics. Why is religion objectionable? Because it's metaphysical. The more common reason for keeping religion out of the public sphere links up with Rorty's notion of it as a conversation stopper. I mean, it's just awkward. People get het up about religion. People care about it, so let's keep it out. Let's not rock the boat. Apart from the definite underlying materialist, physicalist assumptions, there is also invoked the contingent state of public opinion in contemporary societies. We live, we're told, in pluralist societies, and how often is that word pluralism bandied around? Radical disagreement is the norm in moral and religious matters, but not, it seems, in scientific ones. The only way, therefore, we live together is by agreeing to differ on contentious matters. For those of you who know much about political philosophy, you will recognise that Rawls is often quoted in this context. And he says, we must distinguish between a public basis of justification, generally acceptable to citizens on fundamental political questions, and the many non-public bases of justification belonging to the many comprehensive doctrines. Comprehensive is a term of art for him, and it means religion or any particular view of what's important in life. But he thinks those are acceptable only to those who affirm them. So once again, we have a distinction introduced between public and private. This time, public reason, private reason. Religious views epitomise those which have a non-public basis of justification. We must, in fact, keep with publicly shared methods of inquiry and forms of reasoning, and inevitably the methods of science are going to be the best example of that. Now, Rawls talks of shared methods of inquiry and forms of reasoning, assuming them to be familiar from common sense, and he goes on rather more explicitly to say they include the procedures and conclusions of science and social thought, where these are well established and not controversial. In other words, his just society assumes radical disagreement over religion, but takes the methods and conclusions of modern science as its starting point. So again, there's the kind of bias against religion, the value-ridden private aspects of life, and the public notion of science. And of course, great things follow from this, and they're applied in the United States. It follows that science there can be taught in schools, and religion can't. So you only have to talk of something as being religious, and it's going to be outlawed, absolutely, because religion mustn't be mentioned at all. And indeed, as a lot of people even object to the fact that, of course, the Bible is very often not even referred to in schools, so even the Bible as literature isn't dealt with. To play safe, keep clear of the whole thing. Science, though, is assumed to be respectable. Now, what criterion, then, is being adopted for a view which has such major effects on how society is to be organised and education carried out? Rawls, it's interesting to see, is putting forward a political view, not a metaphysical one. He thinks he's advocating a framework that reflects current social reality, that in Western societies people respect science but disagree about religion. Rawls' dichotomy between public and private bases of justification then depend on what is generally acceptable to citizens. Science is susceptible to public justification, religion isn't. And if we didn't live in a pluralist society, but in one where there was a more settled agreement about religion and morality, on this understanding it seems as if they might well be part of public life. It all happens to be what's established at any time in a given society. Now, I think there needs to be a principal distinction here between science and religion rather than a mere appeal to current sociology. Why should democracy be founded on science? Because in a sense this is what's being said, but has to restrain the public parading of religion. It looks sometimes almost as if religion is being made to be the enemy of democracy, and I think that's particularly dangerous because you might argue that actually religions, or particular religions' views of freedom, for instance, might form a particular basis for democracy. But Rawls takes reasonable pluralism to be the result of a free human reason, but he doesn't extend this analysis to science as well. He just takes all that at face value. We take it for granted, it seems, that scientists agree, or they agree on the procedures, as I've said. But one reason why scientists can be expected to agree, even if only at some hypothetical final agreement, is that they have something to agree about, namely the character of the physical world. There is a way the world is. In philosophical jargon, this is realism, a basic realist understanding of science, which sees science as attempting to match our purported knowledge with an independent reality, not just make up nice stories. And that's a very, very important insight. Science is about a real world. Pragmatists, like Rorty, may want to take the fact of agreement at face value and not talk about metaphysical reality of one kind or another. And they then leave untouched the question of what's justifying the agreement. If we all come to a final agreement, why is that going to be final? If agreement alone is the aim, science quickly itself becomes a political matter, requiring compromise. It's no longer a quest for truth. Well, whatever you might say about science and realism, the implication on all this is there isn't the same kind of constraint on religious belief. It's being easily assumed that actually one of the reasons that science can reach agreement amongst its practitioners and religion can't is there isn't the same constraint of reality. I think again there's a materialist assumption being smuggled in here. The fact of pluralism is accepted as inevitable. So the physical world is seen as taking up the whole of reality, and religion has nothing left to agree about and nothing to appeal to in order to settle disputes. All we have then are beliefs, no fact of the matter to constrain them. On the other hand, as I said, physical reality is no figment of our imagination. So pluralism in religion is then our starting point and our finishing point. And in a sense, then, religious disagreement can be a further justification for relying on science alone, because this agreement, whether or not in science, is contrasted with total disarray in religion. Rawls linked pluralism to the operation of human rationality. Given freedom, we may very often have less than total information on any given matter, and it's sometimes not surprising if we come to different conclusions given the same evidence. Yet, all right, that's the case in religion, but is the situation so very different in science? It isn't always the case that empirical evidence is so strong it's irrational to go against it. Science, as I've indicated before, is in a continually dynamic state. It progresses through disagreement, through the testing of alternative theories. Science itself depends on freedom, both on an individual and an institutional level. Indeed, you could say that's one reason why science hasn't progressed in some places and times. If the requisite freedom is lacking, it's very difficult to actually discuss freely and think of alternative possibilities. Totalitarian government does and has stifled scientific inquiry. Uniformity of belief imposed on scientists, particularly for non-scientific reasons, means the death of science. Though even if it's imposed for scientific reasons, as the work of people like Kuhn showed 40 years ago, that itself can be stultifying. Without bold conjectures and the stimulus of competing understanding, science itself fossilizes. Scientific theories are always only partial. Everything is open to challenge. Knowledge can't expand once we become complacent about it. And this expansion of knowledge thrives on the disagreement which occurs under conditions of freedom. And science itself can be rejected by people who think that it's the source of many of the problems of modern life. In a free society, people are and should be free even to do that. They may be irrational in doing so, but they can still do it. So we can't expect total agreement within the practices of science, nor even outside it about its worth. So there isn't this monolithic agreement about science. Scientists don't necessarily agree. There are plenty of non-scientists who question the value of contemporary science. In this respect, science as a human practice is not so very different from religion. There may be a difference of degree, but I think not of kind. Now, of course, religion itself is far from a unified body of knowledge, and one of the problems is there are lots of different religions. And I mean, there's no doubt that's what those who attack religion latch on to. And not all of the religions can be equally rational. But you can see that if there is such a thing as the transcendent or the infinite, quite clearly our knowledge of it itself can only be partial and provisional, and we can expect different understandings of it. I would argue that science and religion are themselves both concerned with what may be true. They both have to accept that human understanding will never be complete, and perhaps religion is dealing with matters that are even more difficult than much of science. An authoritarian approach to religion can certainly lay down what is and isn't acceptable in a society. In a particular society, you can rule out individual freedom. But just as science itself flourishes in an atmosphere of freedom and depends on it, religion itself ought to be, in fact, built on that idea of freedom. John Locke, in his essay on toleration, said that the way to salvation is not, in fact, being any forced exterior performance. It depends on the voluntary and secret choice of the mind. And he was writing in favour of toleration, but writing very much as an Anglican in the late 17th century. Where there is freedom, though, and you might say that our notion of freedom depends on an idea, on the fact of free will, perhaps God-given. Where there's freedom, there will be disagreement. But this can be a sign of health and vigour, as well as a lack of knowledge. And reality can constrain us and can lead to agreement in a variety of contexts. In science, the idea that we should be in possession of all relevant and possible empirical information seems purely hypothetical, except in very artificially constrained and limited cases. Indeed, I suppose the limiting of experimental conditions is a way of trying to bring things down to a manageable extent. And we can obtain knowledge, but it's very often, as I've said, partial. Pluralism, then, if you just think of it as the fact of difference of belief, divergence of belief, these aren't a threat to the idea of truth. They are themselves part of science. Just because scientists argue with each other, and sometimes very radically, doesn't mean there's no truth to be discovered. And it shouldn't be surprising that religion finds the same, particularly when by definition it's dealing with matters that may well, as I've indicated, outstrip for human understanding. Both science and religion have to depend on the freedom of individuals to form their own opinions and belief. Both need human rationality, and that itself requires a background of freedom. Freedom and reason go together. Someone who is coerced to believe something but doesn't really believe it, pays lip service to it, is therefore not a good example of this kind of thing. When Locke argues against public restrictions on religion, and he was particularly, of course, concerned with religious freedom, he points out that such a compulsion can't produce any real effect to that purpose for which it is designed, because it doesn't alter men's minds, he said. Locke argued for the public toleration of religion, and of course he was writing at a time when, in 1689, there was a Bill of Rights in this country, and gradually greater toleration entered in. The mindless imposition, of course, of religious orthodoxy might itself be also self-defeating, just as the imposition of scientific views goes against the very spirit of critical inquiry. But toleration is very different from privatizing religion, saying it can't be a matter of public rational discussion, not to be discussed in the public arena, not to make any contribution in the formation of public policy. There are other people today who say if you give a religious reason in public, that should be outlawed. You're bringing in contentious matters that in fact can't be dealt with. And I think that all that makes sense really if you think religion is actually about nothing at all, merely a matter of individual choice, merely a matter of value. And if that positivist prejudice that religion can't concern truth is removed, you really haven't got a reason for keeping religion private. In fact, some of the most important beliefs may stem from religion, and they're the most important motives for action. If religion is making a claim about an objective reality, this must have universal significance. If it's making a claim that seems to most people to be fundamentally irrational, this should be argued about. Now, disagreement is certainly, I'm arguing, the lifeblood of science, and it's also the bedrock of democracy. There's no need for politics, for democratic negotiation, if everyone in society is in perfect agreement. So there seems to be a fear, though, of disagreements that we don't know how to solve. But I would go so far as to say, actually, that's the normal condition of citizens in a democracy. You're never going to get, and you shouldn't expect to get, this kind of perfect agreement. Pluralism is surely the common rot of humanity. You find that if you want to belong to a society where everybody agrees with you, you're going to be in a society of one person. So nobody will ever totally agree in the same way about everything. And this is why, of course, in the past orthodoxy and uniformity have sometimes been enforced, because they don't come naturally. One of the problems in all this is the slippery nature of the terms public and private. In one sense, religion is and ought to be a private matter, because if we define public as pertaining to the state, civil servants are public officials, it's no part of the state's business what my religious beliefs are. Yet in this sense, science shouldn't be public either. It shouldn't be a decision of the cabinet or whoever what scientific views are put forward. If any government requires scientists to accept particular theories, science is in big trouble. State science is a contradiction in terms, just as compulsory observance or compulsory worship isn't the same thing as worship freely given. So even science shouldn't be public in that sense, but it clearly is in the sense that it makes claims that are publicly accessible. We're back with this notion of being publicly accessible, and people would say, well, perhaps religion isn't. And perhaps, again, we're back with the positivism that says public verification and falsification goes to the heart of the scientific enterprise. Many scientific claims outstrip our ability to test them at any given time. But the whole point of science is to make claims which can be checked by anyone everywhere. A claim made in London can be tested in Beijing. Now that's all common sense. Science deals with matters of public relevance, or at least most people believe it does. Yet why is science therefore publicly acceptable? It must be for a better reason than that people do accept it. It can't just be a sociological point. If public reasons are merely what are taken to be acceptable at a given moment, that's a very insubstantial ground. Once we rule out the apparatus of an authoritarian state, the question still remains why religious arguments can't be heard in the public square, but scientific ones can be. And indeed, of course, from the point of view of people interested in any dialogue between science and religion, if religion is deemed private and science public, the idea of rational dialogue between the two is ruled out. They're just different things that never meet. And all this is a neat way of removing religion from any contact of science. Religion is just restricted to personal life. And the further consequence is that science can't be expected to teach religion anything. Well, I've argued that I think pluralism within science is beneficial for its development. That suggests that in science, in society at large, the fact of competing beliefs, in fact, doesn't necessarily suggest that truth is not at stake. Divergence of belief shouldn't turn us to a debilitating relativism. Disagreement within a democracy should be the prelude for more debate. As I've said, there isn't any need for democratic institutions if we have perfect agreement. The suspicion in the case of religion, and it is made more or less explicit by people like Richard Rorty, is that the religious views themselves aren't regarded as being rationally held in the first place. So my argument really is that this division between science and religion is very often part of the restriction of rationality to science in a totally arbitrary way. It's suggesting that reason and religion have no contact with each other at all. And of course that is a convenient position for those who want to marginalize religion. The idea of the private in the context of religion is rather curious. Religion is a private matter. It's a free personal choice, not dictated by the state. But as I've suggested, I think that even political choices in democracy might be in that category. It doesn't mean that they can't be publicly discussed. My choice, your choice about politics or anything else can still be subject to rational discussion. There are the demands of freedom and those of rationality. And I think human rationality can't and shouldn't be parcelled up into self-contained compartments, let alone monopolised by one of them. We all live in the same world. We live in the same public objective reality. If religion is making any claim to truth, it's a truth that applies to everybody everywhere, so it has a universal applicability, a public applicability. So the project of privatising religion means that religion actually isn't concerned with any such public objective reality. Indeed, it isn't concerned with reality. That must be the conclusion. So the motivation for keeping it in the private sphere is often that while people should be free to believe what they want, rationality is carefully circumscribed. So the privatising project is a device for preventing religion from making public truth claims or to share in any overarching rationality. Religion is kept from the public arena because it's believed on grounds it might be thought that lay no claim to rationality. And then relativism creeps in. A restriction on the idea of public reason in this way, confining it to what is generally acceptable, whether that's defined, and prejudges democratic debate before it's even begun. We shouldn't be told what can't be discussed. Rationality is not a political notion. It isn't to be defined narrowly by science. Rationality must track reality. Now, needless to say, what's real doesn't depend on any current understanding of it, because we're all fallible. But those who say that religion is a private matter are saying that, well, a free society must tolerate it, but religious claims aren't really about anything. On the other hand, many would say that religious claims are the most important of any that can be made about the world at all. Thank you.
Good, thank you very much indeed, Roger. So we've got some good time now for questions and discussion of this paper, and who wants to kick off? Yes, Patrick.
Roger, many thanks for that, and I look forward to the book. But to try and be a sort of constructive critic, I wonder how you'd respond if someone suggested that at times you sound sort of grudging. You made quite a sarcastic comment about a sort of Rawlsian approach where we all trade in some of our freedoms in return for...
I don't believe in that kind of liberalism.
Yeah, well, then how would you respond to someone who says, in fact, that sort of liberalism can even be justified from a Christian perspective? St. Augustine himself said there are certain things that we can get agreement on in the secular city, and so Christians ought to be able to make some accommodation with the secular city, because there are certain things we hold in common as being valuable, although for different reasons, and that what the political liberal is trying to do is avoid the terrible wars and conflicts of religion that racked Europe, and we can see the threats now. But, some of the things you mentioned at the beginning are very frightening to people, and they react to the sights of people who obviously care very deeply, as you said at the end of your talk, about these matters, and see that these people are not open to reason. Indeed, they're threatening violence, and that has, as a matter of fact, been part of the history of Europe, and part of the reason why Locke felt the need to argue for tolerance. And indeed, it is, whether we like it or not, the case that increasing levels of education and scientific learning in America do seem to be correlated with lowering of religious belief. America is full of creationist belief that would reject standard evolutionary science. So you can see that your average liberal is going to be threatened by these things, and that as Christians we might want to be generous and say, well, actually we're quite pleased to live in a liberal society, and that though we want to argue for our case, we are aware that the gospel itself doesn't give us any reason to think that everybody will ever be convinced by these things.
Could I actually say something deliberately provocative and say I don't want to live in a liberal society, I want to live in a Christian society. And I believe part of a Christian society is liberalism. Because I think the problem about liberalism is that if it free floats, it can't transmit itself to the future. If you allow absolute freedom, how is freedom, the love of freedom, to be taught to future generations? Unless you think there are some things that are actually intrinsically important and valuable that should be taught, then you're not going to maintain a free society. I mean, freedom isn't up for negotiation. And liberalism sometimes finds this actually a problem, because actually before long liberalism has to backtrack and say, well, actually there are comprehensive doctrines that we have to sign up to. And in fact, many people would say liberalism is itself a comprehensive doctrine. It's a doctrine of substance about the kind of society we want to live in. And I would say, yes, I want to live in a free society where individuals are free, where we tolerate and respect others. Why? And actually, I believe in, for instance, liberty, equality, fraternity, a kind of good atheist 18th century slogan, I suppose. But where does liberty come from? Why are we free? Because God has given us free will. Why are we equal? Because God has made us like that. Locke would sign up to all these views. What about fraternity? What sense does that make unless you believe in the fatherhood of God? So you can give a religious, even specifically Christian root to these views. And I think it's terribly important to see that Locke, one of the first apostles of liberalism, writing in a very definitely fraught time, he lived through a lot of difficult times. He was in exile in the time of James II, for instance. He knew what real violence could do to his home village in Somerset. There was a terrible battle in Somerset in 1685 when Locke, the Battle of Sedgemoor, when Locke was an exile, and people were rounded up as traitors and hanged in his home village. So he knew all about that. But he was writing as a Christian philosopher. He wasn't saying, it's Christianity. He said a lot of terrible things have been done in the name of Christianity. He was under no illusions about that. But he wasn't giving up on Christianity or the Christian roots of his beliefs. And I think in a way we ought to
say you need to follow the line that Locke taught, and you need to go beyond Locke. Locke thought that atheists couldn't take oaths because
absolutely.
You can't
he didn't like Catholics either.
Locke was only but halfly reformed from the liberal perspective. But what I'm saying is, though you might embrace liberalism because you've got a comprehensive view which involves Christianity, other people won't accept your Christianity, but they may well buy into liberalism. And liberalism offers us that the public square where we can negotiate.
Because another way of looking at this is adopting more a natural law view and saying, well, there are things that are right and wrong that all people can recognise as being good and bad for human beings. You don't have to be religious to see that if you do something it will kill you or kill other people. And all people of goodwill can recognise this. And so there's a lot of common ground. And I'm not denying the importance of finding common ground with people who disagree. But at the same time, I'm reluctant to say that people can't produce their innermost beliefs in the public sphere. In fact, from a political point of view, all that happens is you put it's like a pressure cooker, you just put the lid on it, but actually it's all going on underneath, and then you get things like the religious right in the United States who will just try and operate other political levers to get their way if they can't just have a rational debate. And actually the premise behind all of this is that religion is itself, or some forms of religion, Christianity, most forms of Christianity, is a rational thing. Faith and reason are not separate. That they should be, in fact, dealing with the same thing. And it's terribly dangerous to, in fact, treat all religion as being the same kind of thing, as being non-rational, because then you can't separate out very fearful evil forms of religion from better forms. And indeed, you see in the United States and other countries where they believe they should respect religious freedom, they can't discriminate between any kind of religion. There was one case, and you wouldn't believe this, but this was in the 1970s in the Midwest. A group of prisoners formed a society, a religious society, the main belief of which was that on Friday night they should be served steak and Harvey's Bristol Cream Sherry. And now, anybody would say, come off it, we're not having that. But they won in the law courts because they claimed it was a sincerely held religion and ought to be respected. Oh dear, it's religious, we can't do anything like that. Well, that's mad, absolutely mad. And of course there are some more evil forms of religion that if you respect, then terrible things could happen.
Good, let's broaden this out. Yes, there we go. Yes.
I wonder whether in the relative absence of religion from a lot of things these days in the postmodern world, people make religions out of their view of science.
Yes.
There might be a few people who will demonstrate against Jerry Springer at the opera, but a lot more people who will demonstrate rather violently at Huntingdon Life Sciences about legitimate science being carried out. A lot of, well, the people who work there will believe for the good of humanity and would want science to recognise that what they're trying to do is for good, or, you know, and there is all this kind of thing, controversy about whether we are using energy sensibly and all this sort of thing. The science is actually the subject of great controversies these days, rather than religious faith. And those, it seems to me, are very vital to people's lives about where they see the planet going, our environment going, my neighbourhood going, and that sort of thing, that do grip people, and there isn't a consensus there.
No.
And they do take the place of religions for a lot of people.
Yes, absolutely. And I did mention, of course, I mean, some people think that science is itself the source of a lot of evil in the world. I mean, they'd say global warming and everything, well, that's all the result of technology and science. And I mean, certainly, science is itself the cause of a lot of dissension. I mean, when we talk about the agreed procedures of science, they're not agreed by all people everywhere, and certainly not outside science. So there is great dissension. I think you're quite right to draw attention to that, yes.
Would it be helpful to distinguish within science? So, I mean, there's two types of dissension, aren't there? There's the dissension over the application of science, and there's the dissension within the scientific community about the validity of theories.
Yeah.
And it always seems to me that you can picture science like a sort of cruiser steaming through the water, and then you've got the bow wave, which is where there's lots of excitement and froth, and you know, this is what science tends to get into the public domain because it's all full of controversy and so forth. And then things sort of settle down, and generally then the scientific community finally agrees on what the correct sort of answer is, and that's the bit behind, you know, the sort of the weight behind the ship, which gets into the textbooks, and perhaps isn't so interesting as stuff that people have to learn at schools. So you have this sort of process going on the whole time, and I think your dissension that you're talking about is one aspect of science, but then the scientists would want to say, well, at the end of the day, you know, there is pretty good agreement, you know, about
well,
what
on
is
some,
the case.
on some things, I mean, of course, we all agree
DNA
that
is
this is H2O and some things, but I mean, on some of the bigger issues about the origin of the universe and so on, and whether there is more than one universe, there's great dissension, and also not altogether clear how you'll settle the arguments either. It gets a bit metaphysical. So there is a lot of disagreement that actually, well, I don't know in the longer scheme of things it may get settled, but who knows? I think sometimes people tend to concentrate on the fact that science is very good at settling some disputes, but there are lots of things that it's grappling with and can't deal with. I mean, there are lots of the nature of the brain and the relation to consciousness, for instance, is a good example. I mean, there's a lot of work going on about it. Perhaps one day we'll be clearer about it, perhaps we may not be. And it isn't altogether clear where one's going to get with that. I mean, there is this idea, I think, that science has agreed procedures, at least we know how we would go about it, and religion doesn't. But I'm not sure, even at the frontiers of science, whether they're even sure that they can get agreement about the procedures, because you're dealing with things that are almost intrinsically beyond our reach. I mean, how on earth do you ever settle the argument about many universes, for instance? I'm not sure.
Two books have just come out critiquing string theory on these grounds, actually.
Yes.
One by Lee Smolin, on the grounds that it's really on the borders of metaphysics and science, and simply at the moment nobody can think up ways of testing string theories. Other questions we have? Minutes. Yes.
You criticise those who claim that rationality has no place in religion, but can you give a single example of a basic religious belief which is based on rational argument and not dogma?
Yeah, but that implies a prejudice on your part, because you would say, whenever I mention God or the resurrection or anything like that, you'll say that's dogma, it isn't reason. And if we talk about the historicity of something, and I'll say, well, there's historical evidence, I'll talk about historical evidence, you will say, no, because it's something kind of which involves divine intervention, that's dogma.
Well,
so there's a kind of...
What is it?
Pardon?
If it isn't dogma, what is it? It's not based on reason.
Why do you say that? Why can't it be based on reason? I don't understand what
It's
there is
for
about
you to
reason
say.
that says you can't.
If you claim it's reasonable, what's the reasoned argument, say, for the existence of God, if you like? There isn't one. What is the reason?
That sounds pretty dogmatic to me as well, actually. You're rather saying, I mean, we can talk about arguments for the existence of God. I'm not going to say I can prove the existence of God. But there are reasons for and against the existence of God. The fact of evil in the world is a pretty, at first sight, an argument
against. Yes, but no religious person is prepared to discuss this openly and change his belief if the argument contradicts his view. He believes in God first, and then he argues about it afterwards. He should argue about it and decide whether it's worth believing in or not.
Yes, I would dispute that as necessarily an account of religion. I'm not a Catholic, but I'm sure that I noticed the Pope in that speech, in that lecture in Germany, was actually criticising precisely the view of reason that you're putting forward as being too narrow a view of reason. That I don't see. I mean, I'm not going to say reason can get a grip on the notion of God necessarily, but to say it can't itself seems to me dogmatic. I don't see why one can't talk about, say, the history of the resurrection and beliefs about it, and argue about whether, well, is there good historical evidence or isn't there? Now, a lot of people would say, well, there couldn't be because it's supernatural. End of their argument. And that's begging the question. That's all I'm saying. So when you say it's dogmatic, I think what you're saying is anything supernatural is dogmatic. You can't reason about it. Well, that's to define reason in a narrow Enlightenment way. And I would say, well, I'm not going to say that these things did happen, but let's talk about them. At least I would have thought you can talk about them. I don't see why you can't. I mean, I could provide you good arguments as if somebody digs up Jesus, something that's obviously Jesus' skeleton, then that's going to be a very powerful argument against everything that was said about the resurrection. So there are, reasons even of empirical kind for and against these things. And there are lots of arguments.
There are so many points which could be settled and are simply not by the religious thought. The doctrine of transubstantiation, if you like, could be easily proved by one scientific experiment. You can test whether the communion wine has any blood in it by a simple scientific experiment. Yet the religious people refuse to do the experiment. They say, oh, we must believe it, it's got to be faith. We can't rely on experiments to find out whether this is true or not.
Yes, of course that's a contentious example. I'm afraid I'd approach it by saying, well, it also depends on a view of substance that philosophically isn't held nowadays either. So if you put it in terms of substance, no, it absolutely puts a big question about the whole account of the doctrine. How can you? If it's being cast in terms of Aristotelian substance and people don't believe in Aristotelian substance, then that's whatever truth the doctrine is meant to enunciate. It isn't being put in very good terms if it's using that philosophical language. And anyway, that's another big issue.
We've got 2 more minutes, and I think maybe there's one person who hasn't asked a question yet. Would you like to? Yes.
Yes, I wanted to ask a question really about. Well, it's a sort of distinction between what equivocation as to what counts as religious in some contexts, and this is, I think, particularly nicely illustrated in the American example, because a lot of contemporary philosophy is much influenced by that example. You have people like Rawls arguing that you shouldn't invoke religious reasons, though I seem to recall in a footnote he makes an allowance that it's okay when it's establishing the equality of all persons in that society. So Martin Luther King wasn't acting in that book. But on the other hand, you have a 60s Supreme Court decision where a conscientious objector who professed no supernatural beliefs was held to have a religious reason for purposes of being excused military service as a conscientious objector. So it seems there's certain equivocation. Does religious mean about God, souls, etc., or does it mean deep convictions about the nature of the universe?
Yes.
And it seems to me that many people on the sort of liberal secular side are quite happy to import certain conceptions about the way the world should be, without actually establishing any sort of proof it would be recognised, say, in the context of natural sciences. And if you take Professor Dawkins, for instance, he doesn't derive his moral and political beliefs from his account of Darwinism.
No, I think he's perhaps more influenced by his public school upbringing than he acknowledges. So, the substantial point you're putting forward is a very important one. It goes to the heart of a lot of what the discussion about the role of religion in public life must look at. What do we mean by religion? And if you look at the various charters of rights and various laws and commentaries on them, there's a resolute refusal to define religion. And it's almost a principled refusal. They don't want to get into that. Partly because they think once they define it, they're perhaps biasing the thing, and perhaps they're afraid of talking about it from a Christian point of view, or because anything that looks like Christianity, a belief in God or something. You'll notice that nowadays, when there are laws, particularly in this country, passed about things like this, you'll find that it mentions religion or belief. And this opens the floodgates to just about, how do you define belief? What kind of belief? Now, what they really want to me say is that, of course, atheism is as important as religious belief. It's the counterpart of it, so they want to protect that. If they're saying anything about religion, then it applies to the denial of it too. But it makes the whole thing very vague in a way that's actually very uncomfortable when you come and try and apply the law, because it's not altogether clear sometimes when, for instance, if you want to protect religious freedom, whether in fact, what in fact you're protecting, because some actions motivated by some beliefs would not be accepted by courts, for instance the European Court, as anything that's either religious or like religion.
Oh, certainly. Neither the US Constitution or the European Convention on Human Rights serves to give an absolute right of religious freedom to justify any action on the basis of even a sort of incontestably religious in the sense of supernatural.
Because there is an absolute right, I think, of religious belief. It's the practice that's at stake. But that doesn't mean very much, because it's all about saying you're free to believe anything, because if you can't do anything about it, that doesn't mean very much. So, but when it comes to religious practice, if there isn't any even minimal definition of religion, this makes the law a very, very peculiar beast. And there are plenty of lawyers pointing this out. But of course, once you define it, you've got equal difficulties. So they're shirking this at the moment.
It sort of gets into the realm of family resemblance and things.
Yes, and they do want to be defended from a kind of the accusation of being parochial and just thinking is what we recognise as religion.